welcome to everybody, and thank you for being here. The program, I think, is supposed to, I'll talk for 40, 45 minutes maybe. We'll have plenty of time for questions. I won't run away afterwards. It's my practice to not film or record question and answer periods after talks I give, because it dampens people's willingness to ask a question, so we don't record those. The idea for this speaking tour and talks across the diocese by various people came out of some committee work, and thanks to Gabby Lavek, who's here, been handing things out, kind of encouraged us to do some of these things for the 75th anniversary of the diocese. There's Gabby. Gabby is the editor of our paper, our communications director, and a team of people inside the office has had all kinds of ideas, which a year ago sounded a little scary, but now they're underway. I think we're going to have some fun with it. If my talk comes off half as well as the social media ads that she's been putting out, I'll be doing very well. The objective is to talk about history and future, and that's very open-ended. So I will want to focus in on an outline that you have. I'm going to hit three parts, and it might be a little bit academic, it might be a little on the theoretical side in some places, but I think that's really important because history is a much more complicated thing than what people make out, and I'll explain some of that. So what's the history and what's church history? Number two, what are some institutional structures, both in church and government, that have affected who we are now and where our possibilities might be as we go forward? And finally, in terms of the future of the diocese, it's my role as bishop to kind of outline a vision. If we don't have a vision, if we don't have an idea of where we want to be or what our main work is, then everybody ends up getting kind of frustrated. And you can't do everything. So we have to come back to the ideas. What did Jesus think the mission of the church was? What does God still think the mission of the church? Who are we to be as a Catholic Church? Obviously, history is such a huge topic, we can't cover everything, so you're going to get my kind of views. I got a note there in italics, starting to avoid the addict's perspective. And I've said this in church before without anybody writing the Pope, and it's this. I once did what was called a healing retreat. A whole pile of priests had to go on a retreat. We were divided up into three groups, 180 of us, and so I went with my group. And we got there and we thought it would help us be healers in our parish. And we found out it was to help us heal and understand what healing was about. And so we were broken up into 6 groups, and a woman from one of our diocesan towns, who was a professional addictions counselor, sat in with 6 of us. And she said, I work with addicts. And she said, I can usually, after 2 minutes of conversation, tell whether somebody is an addict, because they have 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the future, and they're pissing on the present. That's what she said. And I think it's important for this kind of talk that while we may be very curious about the past, and we want some very definite direction for the future, the question is, do we know where we are now? Do we know what we're dealing with and what's affecting the way we behave and the way we operate? So let's start with what's history anyway. In my former diocese, a priest worked for a couple of years to write a 75th anniversary history of our diocese, and he wrote it and put it all together, and he presented it to the dean, the then living dean of American Catholic historians, Monsignor John Tracy Ellis. And he presented his book to Ellis, wanted him to write a foreword. And Ellis, in the end, read it, and he said to him, thank you for inviting me, but I'm not going to write a foreword. This is not history, this is a chronology. In other words, a history helps to explain how did things get to where they are. What were people's feelings and motives? What was driving them? What was their vision? And very prosaically, who did they love and who did they hate? And very much of Catholic history, who hated us. And so there's endless stories about having to buy properties through a blind trust because whole towns wouldn't sell anything to Catholic people. So I was pastor of a parish like that in my last bounce. The Irish Catholics they had to be 6-7 miles away in a place called Barons because the people where the economy was, where the river power was, where the industries were, didn't want Catholics living in their town, certainly didn't want a church. That story is repeated all over the place. And not just with Catholics and Protestants. You know, Germans didn't want Irish moving in. The Irish didn't want the Italians moving in. And it goes on and on like that. So you wonder how, and that's true here, why do we have 6 Catholic churches in an area with not a huge Catholic population? It's because some of those ethnic differences were huge. And as I've gotten older, I've calmed down a lot on what some people call racism. I think there's an internal urge. Everybody wants their grandchildren to look like them. And look at today, you look at the Doherty family reunion, people of all different colors and languages are at these reunions now. But it was a tough fight. So history is, how did these communities start? Why are they where they were? And so many of us came to this country, if we look at all sides of our genealogy, because of persecution in Europe or lack of economic opportunity. Somebody was being shut out, they wanted to come to a place where the door was open. So that's the history. And church history, if I had been given church history and not church chronology when I was in high school, my whole education would have ended up being different. The church history courses that I took after college and books that I began to buy and read as I studied theology were just amazing. So there's one story in the late 1700s about the Austro-Hungarian emperor wanting to have certain people not be elected pope, so he sent his envoy into the conclave with a single-shot derringer. And there's a whole history of why an unfired gun is more powerful than a fired weapon. That's probably not anything you ever read about. Or, the fact that certain church architecture, this other book I had, about the number of spittoons in Catholic churches, where there were spittoons next to the altar. I mean, people were dipping snuff all the darn time. So, that's another talk. From earliest centuries, St. Augustine would be our main example of someone who understood that there's the city of man, and that's one kind of a history, and it's a political history. It's a history of empires. And there's another history called the city of God. How is the grace of God interacting in human life and human enterprise? What's the goal of the empire versus what's the goal of the church? What's the goal that God in Christ was on? What was the goal that God sent the prophets to talk about? And so those can be a couple of different things. We live in both places, of course, but one of them, in terms of our faith, should have the ascendance for us, and that we shouldn't do anything in the city of man that would block off our way or access, or anybody else's access, to God's grace, to the city of God. One of the other things about history is I keep buying history books, so I've been, I got out of college almost 50 years ago. And you think, okay, 2 books on church history should do it. But you keep buying books on history, not that the history or the chronology has changed, but professional historians are very well aware that certain things come to light over time. Old files, diaries, letters especially, minutes of meetings that sometimes were hidden for a long time. Both our government and the Vatican archives, they've got a point at which these things can be released. So there was a big fight about releasing the documents from Pius XII during the Second World War because he was said to be in cahoots with the Nazis in punishing the Jews. And so the Vatican began to release a huge amount of documentation showing what was the Vatican and the Church actually doing in Europe in the time leading up to the Second World War. And those are, for professional historians, academics, those are files that are open to people. You can go there with a letter of recommendation from your bishop and request to see certain specific pieces of history. What we learn from all of this history is that change is pretty constant, because no one party is in charge of the change. And so, interestingly, the huge parts of church history are shaped by plagues. You know, like at one point, in 1500, around the time of Galileo, about a third of the population of Europe died out because of the bubonic plague. That makes it very difficult to plan where to put your next parish if your committee keeps dying on you. And so history is not a straight line thing. So if we read history, we find out that people trying to carry out the mission of the church had to deal with politics and politicians. A good number of our saints were killed by politicians or the henchmen working for a king or doing what they thought was the king's will. So the change was going to be constant, not just because of the church coming to different realizations of what Christ wanted, but the church was making contact with various cultures in various places over time. There was a Jesuit priest named Matteo Ricci who, I think the Jesuit order got founded in the 1500s, so shortly after that, he went to China. He mastered the sciences, he mastered the Chinese language, he went to convert the emperor. You couldn't convert anybody unless you converted the emperor. And he had it about all done, and he wrote the Pope and said, hey, I got this going, and all I need is to be able to say Mass in Chinese. And the Pope said, no. So think of how different the world would have been. Think about all those 3,000 Chinese Catholics over at Purdue. Wouldn't that have been great? Would that different? So anyway, but grace also is disruptive. And this is one of the great things about the saints. I brought one of our Indiana natives, a woman who worked and died here, Mother Theodore Guerin. Brought some holy cards over. Somebody offered to give me those as a reminder of our history. But grace breaks into history. Grace can be very disruptive. A few years ago, somebody gave me some Harvard Business School books on disruption as a strategy in business and government and so forth. The theory being great fortunes can be made in times of disruption. Sometimes we don't like to be disruptive, but the saints very often were very disruptive people. And they're not just Catholic saints. I mean, I'm sure we could look at some of the heroes in America who worked with the poor, who worked with Hull House, who worked Martin Luther King, whose holiday we just celebrated. Those people's actions were disruptive. And disruption doesn't always occur in the way that we imagine. Disruption can work in a positive way. During the Civil War, reportedly, a lot of generals on both sides liked Catholic nurse nuns on the battlefield because unlike other nurses out there, they followed orders. Oh, that's bad. I mean, not something that we would normally think of. So Florence Nightingale gets all this huge credit, but if you look at the history of the Catholic nuns on the battlefields and taking care of people on both sides, you find a different kind of story because of the order of their life. Part of the history that we look at when we look at chronology, and I've got several books on this, and I list them at the end, several about the Diocese of Fort Wayne. They deal with buildings. They deal with who lived in a certain place, who owned a piece of property, how many people were in the parish. But it doesn't really talk about the faith life of the people. It doesn't really talk about why people participate in the sacraments, why each of those groups established their own cemetery. Why was that? History should answer certain why questions, which we also should be curious about. So, it's very important that certain people will want to come and get a list of a chronology. That's our day of history, and my talk this evening will be very disappointing. Whereas if we're really looking for history, it makes us understand that we are part of this history making now. And so the conversations we have about our church, of why we do certain things, why we don't do certain things, those discussions are very important and provide us with the wisdom that we can hand down then to other people. One of the history does have a utility. Santayana said, and this is a quote at Dachau on the wall, "Those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it." So it's very important that we have some idea of where we came from, what experiments the church has had that failed, and where certain successes happened, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. And if we look to the saints and some of the holy parts of the church's mission, some things just happen because people look at manifest fruits of the Holy Spirit coming from a certain ministry, and they'll say, this is important, we need to get behind this right now. I've already said something about the Theodore Baron holy cards. Salvation history is a very important term. There were two terms that my freshman Bible teacher told us when I was in college, and he said the word hesed is a word you have to remember for the rest of your life. It is a word that appears over and over again in Jewish scriptures, Jewish prayers, and in our own prayers, and it's translated loving kindness. If you listen for that in where the priest says, let us pray, and a good number of those prayers will mention the kindness of God, our loving kindness. So the history we want to trace is, what are the tracks of that loving kindness? How does that show up? How is that either shared or resisted by us? So we're to reflect this loving kindness of God in our history. And so there's Geschichte, which is history as chronology, and there's the Heilsgeschichte, the holy history, the history of faith, the salvation history that we enjoy. So that would be a different look at the history of the diocese. Apart from writing about bricks and mortar and populations in certain towns and how many kids were in schools and what religious order taught in that town, what would be, if you were to trace the tracks of the Holy Spirit moving through this part of Indiana, what would be parts of that, and where would be the fruits of that in terms of neighborliness, in terms of maybe having an effect on the penal system, certainly on Catholic health care, which I come back to here once or twice. Those are huge marks undertaken for the good of souls and for the good of people, trying to follow God's will at any given time. Not always perfectly, but you look at the struggles that people have had to try and interpret God's will, and it's just amazing to me how diametrically opposed we could be at one time or another. The history of the church in this country is riddled with individuals, Catholic individuals, and Catholic organizations who own slaves. And we look back and we wonder, how could this happen? How could this be? And so that history could teach us something. My guess is in about 150 years, people will look back on us driving gasoline-powered cars and say, what were those people thinking? Because now in Indiana, it's 130 degrees in July and 8 below zero all winter. What were they thinking, burning all those fossil fuels? So, but we're in the middle of it, it's very difficult to see some of those things. So the first part, what is history? And to understand it's not just chronology, it's to try and get into the hearts and minds of people and what motivated them. And I think particularly what's missing in the transmission of our tradition right now may be the understanding of suffering and sacrifice. Most of people my age came up in a tradition of, we understood suffering and sacrifice. We understood it from people who had been in the armed services, people in the Depression, my grandfather in the First World War, stories of our family of the Great Depression of 1896. I mean, there were like 5 Great Depressions after 1850. And so, how do people survive these things? How do they hold their families together? How do they get up every day and have a constructive life and somehow cohere as families and as communities? Those are really important things that have been, by presenting history as a chronology, we've lost sight of why did people do what they did, over time. And some of the reasons are very deep. Institutional structures. I find in part two that the structures of government and society have had a huge effect on us in terms of where we are today. And if we look simply at Indiana, and I should have written, I had a wonderful book written in 2015 by IU, retired IU prof, and it's not here, I've quoted it in other places. The history of this state tells us a lot about why we are the way we are. But if we look at what has affected Indiana, in the southern part of the state, you've got the French coming in, intermarrying and doing commerce with the natives. The English came in the north and wanted to push out all the Indians. They were savages, they wanted nothing to do with them, they didn't want to get to know them, speak their language or anything. And so the history that meets here in Lafayette is really interesting, where people and properties were part of joint efforts between native communities and French and others who came in and had a more, just a different attitude toward the native populations. But we look at what literally has shaped the state. Railroads cannot be underestimated. Railroads reshaped everything everywhere in a fairly short order. In fact, I think when our canal got built down here in 1854, and it was done in 5 years because the railroads came in. The canal was not an efficient way to move goods. Epidemics. We think of smallpox, which the great epidemiology of this, it was transmitted how? On riverboats. How did smallpox move around the United States? Well, through, and then what does that do to communities, to want to do a mission in a certain place, to community resources? If you're a farmer or trying to work the land and get hit by a disease that kills people or tuberculosis, you can read the cause of death given for people in the Greenbush Cemetery up here. Go online, look up the Greenbush Cemetery. It'll give you who was buried. One person was shot. A lot of people died of brain fever, it will tell you. Typhus for a couple of them. Life was tough. A huge part of the church's movement into the state, in this part of the state, was in the 1870s with the Franciscan sisters, in the 1880s with the Daughters of Charity. The sisters arrived in central Indiana to provide health care. I don't think anybody could have imagined what health care would look like, or how it would be available, or how the poor would be taken care of. And the history about what those sisters did, and what kind of care they provided, and how they sustained themselves economically. There were a lot of religious orders that sold subscriptions to health care. Today we call it insurance, but if you're an employer and you pay $2 or $3 a year per employee, you can get the sisters to take care of those people. So the sisters were way out ahead of the curve in some ways. Taken advantage of just as often. Very often doctors would collect the bill and then not pay the sisters for the use of their hospital or their operating room. Those are stories I've also read, both from where it came from and elsewhere. I think if you were to walk into one of the sisters' 1890 surgeries today, you could be sick as a dog and you take one look at that and say, sorry, I'll take my chances and leave. It was pretty primitive by today's standards, but people were doing the best they could. Bring our context up to the diocese, which was founded in 1944. I've said this before too, how many homes in Indiana were electrified in 1944? I don't think it was even half yet. Indoor plumbing, there are records on this. You can go online and look this up, just how much indoor plumbing was there in 1920, 30, and 40. And you get statistics on this, partly taken through the Census Bureau. There were no antibiotics to speak of when the diocese was founded. So, you can imagine illness and injury, polio. Those of us who were kids when we got our polio shots, and we were the first generation to get those, I couldn't quite understand the look of relief on my mother's face, but looking back, certainly understand that. And one other thing they didn't have then, I had a meeting this morning in Carmel. Usually it takes me an hour and 10 minutes to get to St. Elizabeth Seton Parish. Took me over 20 minutes to get to the edge of town, because when the diocese was founded, high school kids did not have cars. There were no traffic jams of high school kids in 1944, probably not until the 70s and 80s. So that's how different the world is. Another huge thing that is accounted for in histories is the Eisenhower era in the 1950s. I think he was president from 52 to 58. 60, that's right, 8 years, 2 4-year terms. And the interstate highway, I thought it was earlier than this, but 1957 is a mark for interstate highways. And I remember moving in 1959, just opened interstate highway between Rockford, Illinois and O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Those interstates have changed who we are. So in the middle 1800s, you had a railroad line running down the Illinois-Indiana line and other places. And then you had Route 52 was built, that was further east. And then even further east, you had I-65. And businesses and towns migrated to those highways. And so when we talk about the shrinking part of the diocese, people followed where the jobs were, where transportation was. And transportation and jobs all seem to be able to go together. But today, that's why Indianapolis is thriving, because they have rail and air and highway system. But that highway system allowed the countryside to drain out and allowed people to move and live in different places and to commute great distances. So today it's nothing for people to commute 60, 80 miles to work in their car one way, because it may be an hour investment, and they get to live in a place that they would prefer to live and raise their children. So we look at the movement of populations in the diocese and look at the effect on our growth and who we are, and maybe how we didn't appreciate how important it was because of what I-65 did, I-69, and then about 15 years ago I was driving back from the East Coast somewhere and came through Indianapolis. And I'd driven everywhere by then, but I thought, who built a 100-mile, 4-lane donut around Indianapolis? Who was their senator? Who did that? And look at the effect of what that donut has had on the state economy. It just drained out the countryside from everywhere else, concentrated everybody. It's great in a certain economic sense, but I don't think we as a church or anybody else were able to account for what it might do to our mission, our religious mission. It also created a problem in terms of white flight, which is also a problem in the growth of our diocese. A lot of our communities are the product of people not wanting to live somewhere else in a mixed community. I know you only have one chance to raise your children. You want them to be safe and all that. But the tools that were created by government to help the economy enable other things to happen that we might not have accounted for very well. The civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, those of us who kind of lived through some of that, that's the nice thing about, I'm only 5 years younger than the diocese, 6 maybe. So my memory of all of these wars and all of these changes is a living memory. Vatican Council II was something, when we talk about who we are in the present, we're still trying to digest the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65. That sounds so awful, but people are resistant. And different things happen in different countries. My one thing I'd like people to remember about the Second Vatican Council, all those bishops got together, and a lot of younger people today, younger meaning under 50, will say that the bishops were all a bunch of ivory tower bishops. They live in their palaces, and they eat well, and they have a meeting, and they decide on. But these bishops came from countries from around the world where 60 million people had just been killed in a bunch of wars. In other places, they'll talk about the Second World Wars in the plural. So these men are meeting like, if 60 million people got killed because something got away from us, what could we do better? What's the ball we have to keep our eye on? And so the Vatican Council is a key thing. And it again point out the need for holiness for everyone. And this does connect with the Church of the Future here. So this is an important term. I've got a couple of books on the Vatican Council. What happened there? And as you read it, the word that keeps appearing over and over again, it is a call to holiness for everybody as part of our Christian faith. Another word is the people of God. The church is to be understood as the people of God. So here we get rid of any supposed distinctions between being a clergyman is holier than being a married person. And we begin to see raising up of the power of our baptism. Historically, we say, well, when you listen to the words of baptism, to baptize the priest, prophet, and king. And you think, okay, well, it's just who we are. But in the early 60s when we said this was one of Martin Luther's great criticisms of the Catholic Church, that we were denying the priesthood to everybody, that we all have a call to holiness. And Luther had a few good things to say. So it's important that we understand that call of the Second Vatican Council, that call that Luther issued in the 1500s, is still a call today. And when we look at some of the problems and issues in the church today, some people didn't get it. And the recriminations that happen right now, this will happen in my analysis of the future, is when people say the church hasn't done anything, in their mind, they're thinking bishops and priests. Whereas for 50 years, we've been trying to get everybody to take ownership of their baptismal priesthood, to be involved. And if the church is going to be holy, everybody has to have a part in that. We can't, when things are tremendous, what's that saying? Success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. And so everybody wants to be a Catholic when things are going great, or when, the Pope comes to your town and you all want to get your picture taken with him. But as soon as a bad thing happens, people are, you damn bishops, you are, I know this is on film. Hi to people watching at home. But that's kind language compared to what people are saying. So we can't have it both ways. We can't say, well, when things go bad, let's blame it on bishops, and when things are going good, we'll all take credit for it. In my experience is the bishops and priests, we've been working very hard. I know in my ministries, from high school work in the mid-70s through the 80s, we get very aware of this. Our bishop was really good, all kinds of training, and people look at us like, the big question is, well, how come the church hasn't done anything about safe environments? And we've been professionally looking at it for decades and decades and reporting on it. And so one of the challenges for the Church of the Future is to communicate something about that. Another change that happened is the pill. And for a lot of Catholics, they thought that contraceptives was just kind of a Catholic issue, but I do strange beach reading, and so I had a book called About the Pill, written by some social historian. And he said, when the pill was being evaluated in Congress to get drug approvals, some 30-year-old guy was working for the government, was the only person to see what would happen. And his comment was, away from the panels doing approvals, was, if this works, this will change the economy of the United States. That's not a religious comment, that's an economics observation. And it did, and it took women, my mother and my sisters, my aunts, they went from a world in which they would love to try and be employed and have a career at something besides a stenographer. They went from wanting to be employed to having to work for the survival of their families. Because with that many more people entering the workforce, just by the nature of the economy, you didn't have to pay a breadwinner changed the nature of labor unions. People who used to be for labor unions, particularly would want people to make a decent wage, to be a breadwinner. And then suddenly when men and women are working equally in the economy, they both want the breadwinner's wage for the household. So I'm for unions. That's another thing that probably should be part of this history. The church had a very long history of being for labor unions. The first bishop of my diocese was also the founder of what's today the U.S. Bishops' Conference. He and another bishop traveled the country in the late teens and early 1920s, fostering labor unions, saying this is going to be the only way out for a lot of people and families. So there was a great alliance there for a very long time. I'll just give you one here about how it's so difficult to keep track of the present that we're dealing with. And it's out of a book. I just picked it up at random. I have a good number of history books that I've kept over the years. I've moved a lot. I've probably thrown out a few hundred books in my life because I can't keep crating them up and carrying them out. And they're not always useful, but I haven't thrown out history books. And so I picked this one up. And I give the quote here. Just think of how the world turned in 1968. From J.T. Ellis's book, he says this: to summarize fully and to interpret adequately the events that have swept the Catholic community in the United States since 1956 in a single chapter is seemingly to attempt the impossible. Yet that is what the new chapter has tried to do. Given the startling pace at which the Church is now moving, some portions of this chapter, written in the spring of 1968, may indeed seem dated by the early months of 1969. And for a lot of people in this room, I can tell you that July 21st, 1968, the Vatican publishes its letter on contraception. I will tell you that I discovered in a drawer at the diocesan paper back in 1976 or 7 when I was a new priest, I discovered that they had kept all of the press releases from the bishops' conferences around the world in reaction to that. And more than half of them said, this is wrong. Bishops' conferences said, this is wrong. And what people don't have is 2 talks that Pope Paul VI gave from his balcony in the 2 weeks after that, saying what a difficult decision this was and how this is going to be torturesome for people, but he didn't see any other way out of this. In other words, it was presented as a black and white thing, take it or leave it, and it changed everything. This went over my head in 1968. I was just a new freshman in college. This thing comes out in July. I start college probably the last week in August. And in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm part of an intramural college football team. I was 32 years old before the light went on in my head about the name of our football team. It was Paul's Pills. I was 17 years old when I started college. I didn't make the connection between what was going on in the Vatican and what was going on the football field. I just didn't. But the other thing is, so he said by 69, things could change greatly. Well, in August of 1969, we had the Woodstock Festival. By then, the train was running at full speed with the Vietnam War, with prison riots, with race stuff. The spring of my senior year, I was in Washington, D.C. There were riots going on. Bombs were going off all night. Today, parents would say, oh, it's not safe, you're not going. How we got there, why we stayed there, I don't know. But we were on a bus, a couple of us, a classmate from Detroit and a classmate from Chicago. We got on a bus at 11 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C. 2 guys got on with a shotgun. Not in a case, they just walked on with a shotgun. And suddenly, I grew up near Chicago. We all thought we knew something about the big city. When that happened, we thought, this is a new game. And so it's very difficult to explain to people how that changed our civil relationships and what kind of tensions the church was under at that particular time. One of the other things in the present, as I said, we've been dealing with 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. with trying to protect children. And I've learned a lot along the way, and a lot of great things have happened. But I would say this has affected who we are as a church. And not always for reasons we might think. It's going to take 100 years for people to look back and figure, what were the real reasons why people may have stopped going to church in the 90s and the 2000s? Is it because of a lack of trust in the bishops? Or is it because when you come into our institution, you're coming into a living, breathing thing that reminds you that there is no part of your past that can't be uncovered. And particularly now, everything's been digitized, all your emails have been recorded, everything is hackable, and it scares people to wander into an institution that your illusions of privacy were just that, they were illusions. And for people who did bad enough things, there's a way to find out what they did and when they did them, and they come out in court, and they come out in various accusations. I think it'll take 100 years for us to find this out, but certainly it has affected everybody in a different way. We've been wildly successful in a statistical way with the protection of children, upgrading our employment practices and all of that, but it just has not registered in the American consciousness. One of the, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but it's kind of the elephant in the room. And so if we're not aware of it, that it has to be dealt with, that we've been dealing with it for 30 years, the disappointment is that why don't people know about all of this? And there are reasons for that too. And it's a popular political thing right now. So over the summer, in July, early August, the Chicago Tribune reported that since 2011, the Chicago Public Schools have suppressed 500 child abuse accusations. That they didn't go to the police for child, they were protecting teachers, the people within unions were supposedly protecting each other. These were handled improperly. 500 just since 2011. So this happens in July. In August, Pennsylvania grand jury comes out, says all that stuff about the church, which is just awful revelations covering almost a 7-year period. And so, on the way out of office, the Attorney General of Illinois says, what does she point to? She doesn't point to the public schools or the Chicago public. She said, we have to do a thorough investigation of all the Catholic churches in the state of Illinois, because obviously they're crooks, they're lying. It's like, okay, one school district, 500 cases, and who do you go after the Catholic Church? So it's a really difficult time. I can't do my work unless I'm aware of this, and it's very hard for Catholics to stay with our mission if they don't know that there are lots of people who have been working very hard for decades to improve our situation, and that are the things terrible that happened in the past? Yes. Are we trying to help victims as best we can? Yes, when we find out about them. Sometimes it takes many years to find out. How can a bishop be responsible for the behavior of his people if nobody tells him what's going on? And I'm sure this happened to a lot of school administrators in Chicago. If people don't tell you what's going on, you institutionally can't react. So, and I'm very proud of the work that's been happening, but we have to improve. But back to this thing of victims, we understand as time passes, more and more what our obligations should be to people. And it's not all financial compensation. I've talked to a number of people since I've arrived 8-9 years ago. They want to be recognized. They want somebody to listen to them. They want some help if you can offer it. And they just don't want anybody else to get hurt. So many people's big concern is if we don't deal with this correctly, then somebody else will get hurt. I don't want that on my conscience. So Bishop, I'm telling you about this X, Y, or Z. So we've got a lot to be very proud of in a very difficult situation. But what we're looking at is a societal issue that makes it very difficult for all of us to move in the same direction at the same time. We look at the future of the diocese. I got some, I think, simple points here. In the last few years, we've been working with consultants, and we're working on accumulating and interpreting relevant data toward a couple of things: good stewardship of human and material resources for the mission. A number of you are aware of across the street, we've got a building that we're trying to figure out how are we going to use, what's going to be its proper disposition. We're going to knock it down, we're going to sell it, we're going to move it, what are we going to do? And I'm at the side of those discussions, but I've advised people to say, don't make it about the building. If we ever have a meeting, it has to be about our mission. Because once somebody takes away our ability to talk about what Jesus is expecting of us and why we do anything on these couple of square seated blocks, then we've lost, we've surrendered the mission. So our mission is incomprehensible if we don't mention Christ and the call to save souls. So that's a huge thing for the mission. And some of the articles I've read recently, I should go back to these history books and point out how many bishops, part of the bishop's role is to make a decision so parishioners don't fight with each other. One of the classics is up in Alaska. They had two churches. A bishop comes in for confirmation about Christmas time, about 1896, comes in and says, I'm closing both your parish churches, and we're going to build another church this side of the river. We're going to have one parish here. There's no story about a consultation, a vote, nothing. The bishop comes and just says this. Well, that way they can all be mad at the bishop. He goes back up to Fort Wayne. They built their new church, which is still there. But to keep our eye on the mission and not on buildings first. Secondly, the future will depend, and this might not have been the case a year or two ago, but today, if we're going to go forward with the mission, we have to communicate knowledge of the Charter for the Protection of Children and what was done from 2002 to 2018, both inside the church's structures and outside of it as we relate to law enforcement and to mental health facilities and those kinds of things. Another thing in terms of the future of the diocese, keeping with the mission, is evangelization and missionary discipleship. The bishops published a nice leadership guide. A lot of parishes are using this for the parish council living as missionary disciples. Gone are the days where the parish pastoral council, their biggest job is to figure out what's going to make our parish festival more fun this summer. Should we have a tilt-a-whirl? Should we have a rock climbing wall? The first discussion is, why are we having a festival in the first place? How is this serving our mission? So we have to keep on all of this. We have to cooperate in the salvation from Christ. We have to keep the eternal dimension before people. I could say this to bishops I worked for, now that I'm a bishop, this idea of standing before the judgment throne is scary. Because I'm responsible for 100,000 people, and 80-some priests, and when things go wrong, I can just, I don't want to be standing there and say, why did you do this? Why didn't you open that letter? Why didn't you go to that meeting? Why didn't you fire that priest? That's good. My interview before I go to purgatory, if I get there, it's going to be a very long interview. Or he's going to ask me the question that he asked Peter, do you love me? That's what I'm going to be judged on. God saying to me, do you love me? And it won't be as fun as that song, Fiddler on the Roof, do you love me? Remember that? Anyway, I say something there about Karl Rahn. Another thing is on page 2, allowing Hispanic peoples to accept us. We always have this idea that, hey, let's welcome the Hispanic people. That's what real Christians would do. Hey, they have their own culture. They have a language. Let them maybe they want to welcome us. Think about that. Think about that. So that's an attitude with which we're going to have to deal with. We're not the givers. We're not That's paternalism, to think we're the givers and somebody else are the takers. There's a lot of people that have a lot of gifts to bring from Hispanic cultures and lots of other cultures here in the state of Indiana. Communication will be central. I had to put this in here because Gabby is here this evening. But much of our vocabulary has been co-opted by the secular society, and we have to translate it back to people. And like there are a lot of things, you know, how often have I listened to talks on Channel 11, WTTW or WFYI, and we guys have these speakers on meditation, and how we can improve it with meditation. Hey, we invented meditation. What's the rosary all about? It's about breathing, if you say it right. So we have a number of practices that have been taken away from us, and we just gave them up. Or how healthy fasting is for you, for your health. Well, we gave up fasting, and now people are writing books and making money on what we used to give for free. So we've got to get that back so we can make money on it. Anyway, and one of the big things, this came up at a meeting again today, going forward, if our church is going to have a future, do not assume that individuals use that word, the church, the same in every conversation. And I say that it's like we have a giant Cracker Jack wiggle picture. Remember when we used to get Cracker Jack? Some of us had these pictures and you could wiggle this little one, and it'll be a cat, and it'll be a dog. Or it'll be somebody with their eyes open and move it, their eyes would close. The wiggle picture wiggles back and forth between the church as the hierarchy and the church as the people of God. And we've got to stop allowing, so whenever we have conversations in parish councils, conversations with friends, kitchen conversations at parties, when somebody talks about the church, please, when you use it, define it. And when they use it, make sure you know what they're talking about. Because as I said earlier, when things are going bad, the church is the bishops. When things are going good, look what a great festival our parish put on. Look what a great school we have. When something goes bad, then the priests take it on the chin. And there's a default there that has been learned. It's just been something in the air for a long time. But I think that has been one of my biggest challenges since becoming bishop, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. The future of the church is going to be, we have to be careful about how we use words. Words have to have content. They have to have a shared understanding among people, which is very difficult to do in the society that we're in. Because everybody wants to define their own words. They want to define their own gender. They want to define their own rights. The Catholic Church, if you read any Catholic document, I learned this especially working with labor unions. I had to do some things in healthcare, so I wrote a 40-page document on everything the church had to say about rights of workers. And of course, anything you read in the church, whenever the word rights appears in a church document, within 4 to 8 words, the word responsibility or obligation appears. So the word rights is always paired. If somebody has a right, then somebody has an obligation to provide that right. So, of course, I gave this to a couple of the shop stewards, and when I see the edited division, everything about responsibility and obligation is edited out. It's just that we have, the Catholic Church says we have this right, and then nobody's got any obligations. And sometimes it can come out in a very simple way. Early on, when we're writing these patients' bill of rights and hospital bills of rights back in the 90s, people wanted patients' rights. Okay. But then I looked at these and I said, hey, there got to be some patient obligations. Yeah, we have the right, we have the obligation to provide you the best care. You have the obligation to maybe do what the physician tells you. Stay off the parallel bars 4 hours after you've had your pancreas removed or whatever, So that would be everything. But I'm getting far afield. I think what I've said, our idea of mission is going to be the future. Our idea of the eternal, and this idea of our salvation, having a personal relationship with Christ, a personal experience with God, and we're going to be working more and more on that. I will be quiet now, because I've hit my time limit, but I appreciate your attention. But as I got into this, it was very difficult to get my arms around it because we don't share a common understanding of history. As history as an idea, we don't share a common idea of how did the church get to where it is. It wasn't all based on people's economic decisions or religious decision. It's in a huge confluence of those in the middle of huge social struggles. You know, and going forward, I'll just give you two ideas. That when I became a bishop, I knew what marriage was. And when I became a bishop, based on observations in the 60s and 70s, I thought this idea of legalizing marijuana is a pretty harebrained idea. And now, you know, people look at you straight in the eye and say, well, this is okay, this is going to be good. And, I don't. I'm not looking for good outcomes. And I'm not looking for a marijuana booth at the Oktoberfest at St. Boniface. So don't even think about it, okay? So thank you very much.